Hello, friends. Welcome to the Merry Corncrakes, the official podcast for the Corncrake magazine. The Corncrake magazine exists to promote English literature, both in the past and the present, bringing classic tales and authors into conversation with contemporary writers. It is a wonderful magazine which you can find online at thecorncrakemag.com. Go there now to see the latest installment. And today we're going to be talking about something which is at the heart of the January edition of the Corncrake, the Scottish poet Robert Burns. Now, what you will have heard before the little intro theme came on was the address to the haggis. The address to the haggis was written by Robert Burns in the late 18th century, and it is a core feature of an event which takes place every January, the Burns Supper. The Burns Supper takes place 25th of January. It began life 5 years after the death of Robert Burns, when a number of his friends decided to hold a commemoration of his life and poetry. He wrote many poems and many songs, and so they would gather together. They would celebrate by reciting his tales, his poems, and having a meal. And what did this meal consist in? Well, it was the haggis, neeps, and tatties, or haggis, which is a kind of meal made up of the entrails of a sheep, neeps, turnips, and tatties, potatoes. The neeps and tatties are mashed. The haggis, coming originally in a sack, is then cut open, and all of its kind of minced entrails pour out, and you have the mince. So you have this lovely kind of brown, orange, and vanilla mashed up foods together. And this would be the sort of thing that Burns himself would have eaten, as haggis being leftover meat and oatmeal combined with turnips and potatoes would be something that ordinary Scottish people could eat. It was very filling. It is very warming in the cold weather. And so it very much connects to who Burns was as an individual. And so as a big part of the Burns Supper is the eating of the haggis, neeps, and tatties. And indeed, it has its own ritual almost. When I go to a Burns Supper today, I will see the haggis paraded in, often with a bagpiper playing tunes as it is paraded through the group and taken to the top table. There, the address to the haggis, which is almost like a blessing or a grace said before a meal, is recited, and then it is shared around. And the Burns Suppers are not just small things. They're not just for one or two individuals. They have become a part of Scottish life. Many communities across Scotland, many groups, social clubs, they will celebrate a Burns night together. Many people will learn the songs from when they were at school or young. And so combined with the recitation of the poems and individuals doing solos, you'll have groups singing. And so in a way, the Burns Night transcends the life of Robert Burns himself into becoming a collective action of Scottish people, both in the past and in the present. It really is a lot of fun, and if you ever get the chance, I would encourage you to go. But why do people celebrate the life of Robert Burns? Why has it become so identified with Scottish community celebration? Why is it Burns in particular which drew this? Because we might wonder, well, there have been many great Scots in history. Somebody like Walter Scott, whose works were known across the world, so much so that many places around the British Empire were named after his novels. If you've ever heard the name Waverley, so Waverley Station in Edinburgh, I think there's a Waverley in India. Well, Waverley was the name of a series of books that Walter Scott wrote. Also, we might wonder, well, okay, maybe Burns, as we'll see, did have a cultural impact, but there isn't many people who have a day or a celebration in their honour with certain rituals and performances, and none really in the last few hundred years. Yes, we have Remembrance Day and Memorial Days for the soldiers who fought in World War I and World War II, But that isn't for a specific individual. We have saints' days like St. George, St. David, St. Andrew, St. Patrick. But these are ancient figures, medieval figures who belong in a world of religion and magic. And so we can kind of buy into the idea that there are rituals to be performed on the celebration of their days. But Burns stands quite unique in that he is somebody in the last few hundred years who has a specific celebration associated with him. And so what I want to do in this little video is say a little bit about who Robert Burns and his significance, what his poetry was about, why it appealed to so many people, why it struck such a nerve, and hopefully that will help to contextualize or provide at least a little introduction into why the Corncrake this month wanted to offer something in terms of the Burns Supper celebrations. And along the way, I will read a little bit of his poetry, which that is probably the starting point. When we look at Burns's poetry, it covers a range of topics, but there are two things which are primarily noticeable. The first thing about Robert Burns's work is that it's written in Scots. Now, Scots is, you might say, the language of the lowlands of Scotland. It's very easy to think that there is English and Gaelic. Gaelic being a distinct language, a Celtic Q language spoken by the peoples of the Highlands and Islands, or at least some of them. It's a small group now who would speak it, but in the past it would have been, in those regions, the main language. And Gaelic is distinct from the Irish Gaelic, but it is very similar, which is understandable when you think of the Western Isles being only across the Irish Sea from Ireland. Actually, that in some ways, the western part of Scotland, the western coastline, for a lot of its history, would see the northeast of Ireland as closer to it than they would Edinburgh, because that was the kind of central thoroughfare, the place where they lived. But Scots is like English in that if you read it, you would understand many of the words just from looking at it, but it is different. And it's more than just a regional difference. There are different spellings and different words. And although Scots has gradually been eroded, in Burns's time, it was still what most people in lowland Scotland would have spoken. It could also be known as Lallans or something like that. And there are channels online which celebrate the Scottish language and draw attention to its unique wonderfulness. There's a kind of rudeness, and by that I do not mean coarseness, although that's often how it descends these days. It becomes denigrated in that, but rather that there is a rough simplicity, I think, in Scots, which perhaps is to do with the history of Scotland, the history of this language, that it retained its main character in rustic places. Perhaps these are some of the influences. And also, although there was a Normanization of Scotland in the 1100s, unlike England, where the Normans ruled England, Scotland, that wasn't the case. There was an adoption of Norman ecclesiastical reform and institution of structures, but linguistically, you don't get that same change, I think, as you do in England. The court isn't a French court. That's my point, although you do have many Frenchmen coming across. So Burns's poetry is in Scots. And this gets to something very important for his work, that it is about Scotland and Scottish life and ordinary Scotland. It's not trying to be a classic in Latin. It's not trying to be sophisticated in French. It is not something pan-European. It is appealing to a national people, a group, with a folk with their own language and customs and life. And much of Burns's poetry is focused on the ordinary things that Scottish people had to deal with. In this respect, He is a romantic poet, indeed one of the pioneers of the romantic poetical movement, which takes place in the late 18th century, early 19th century. In England, figures like William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge would be similar. Romantics were focused a lot on ordinary experience and finding beauty in the ordinary. This would include landscapes, natural places, such as the Lake District, or in Burns's life, it would be the farmland which he tilled, the Ayrshire coast and countryside. But at the same time, also ordinary people. And so Burns very much works with experiences he has, such as ploughing a field, or being in church and seeing a louse climbing up a lady's bonnet. It's going to the pub. It's having a fellowship meal with friends. Examples of this might include one of his most famous poems, To a Mouse. And I will read a little bit of it and then say a little bit about the context of it. So, "Wee sleekit cowering timorous beastie, oh what a panic's in thy breastie! Thou needna start awa sae hasty, wi bickering brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee, wi murdering pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt no wiles, but thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou maun live. A daemon ichor in the thrave, sae small request, I'll get a blessing with the lave, and never miss it." And it goes on, and the context of this poem is Burns was ploughing one of his fields and suddenly had to halt because there was a mouse lying in the path of the plough. And many a farmer would have run over that poor wee mouse. But Burns, who had a love of nature and of the beauty of creatures, decides to spare the mouse because it is a living being. This is the sort of thing Burns is doing. He's dealing with the ordinary things of life, but yet drawing out their profound significance. And in the small moments, in the run-of-the-mill moments, there's actually decisions of massive significance and importance. And there is beauty in the simple. In this respect, then, as I've said, Burns is very much like somebody such as Wordsworth, who would do the same in the Lake District. He's not just writing poems about the magnificent classical world, but actually about the landscapes he's looking at, the poor families he's coming into contact with, and so on. And one of these themes that Burns very much takes up in some of his poetry is the cause of justice. He was a Masonic brother. He belonged to the Masons, who had this strong idea of the brotherhood of man, that all men are equal before God, and that the world is unjust because of these unfair hierarchical relationships, these traditions, such as having monarchs and lords and aristocrats who have robbed the land, essentially, and thus it needs to be overturned and restoring an equity amongst all people. So, again, like the Romantics, he was big on social reform. And tied into that, another theme which builds throughout the Victorian era is the hypocrisy of polite society. This idea that having wealth or power or the right clothes or even the right religion somehow makes you superior to those who have less than you was something that he was vigorously against. He saw in it a shallowness that if you do not have the character, if you do not have the moral virtues, then actually you are not superior than anybody else. And this would be a theme picked up by somebody like Thomas Carlyle, that what matters isn't the clothes you wear, the amount of money in your bank account. What matters is the genuine sincerity of an individual in their dealings with others. Is it all a smokescreen? Is it all an illusion? Is it all hiding something that's rotten at the core? Or does it reflect who you truly are? And so his most famous poem in this regard is called A Man's a Man for All That. And I'm going to, this is a song, and I'm going to sing a couple of verses which will give you a sense of what Burns's kind of political program was. Ye see on Burkey called a Lord, Westrats and stairs and all that, though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that, for all that, and all that, his ribbon star, and all that, the man of independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. A prince can make a belted knight, a marquis duke, and all that, but an honest man's a boon his might. Good faith, he's money for that, for all that, and all that, the dignities and all that, the pathos, sense, and pride are worth a higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will, for all that, that sense and worth o'er all the earth may bear the gree, and all that, for all that, and all that, it's coming yet, for all that, that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be, for all that. Combined with his egalitarianism and his love for the pastoral and the ordinary, Burns was a committed nationalist and a romantic nationalist, which was a large spread movement during this period that, for many individuals, the overturning of the traditions, of the unjust impositions by the aristocrats, by the lords, by the kings, would be found in a return to the national roots of a people, to their heritage, to their tradition, to those things which had been lost, in part due to these corrupt institutions, and increasingly through the 19th century, there was a shift in this to an idea that actually industrialization was part of what had robbed a people of who they are. And so restoring that, returning them to their ethnic roots, was going to be vital to restoring the people and their culture. And so Burns is kind of a forerunner of this with his Jacobite tendencies. Now, the Jacobites were a bit earlier than Burns, but still in the same century, the 18th century. And there had been a couple of revolutions or restoration attempts trying to return the Stuart dynasty to the throne of Scotland, and more broadly of Scotland and England. At the same time, there was also a movement which Burns would have supported against the union of not just the crowns, but of the parliaments. So prior to the 1700s, Scotland and England, though they shared the same king, were distinct countries. It would be like if the king was both the ruler of, or Donald Trump is the president of both America and Canada, but that they have different governments. And so he has to oversee the two governments in different ways, different laws, different customs, so on. But in the 1700s, the two were brought together in very controversial circumstances after a attempt by Scotland to expand its colonies led to bankruptcy, and this led to a situation where the English promised to bail out Scotland on the provision that there was a union of parliaments. At least this is a very simple kind of summary of it. And there were many Scots who were for this union, who thrived in the British Empire. There were many who were against it, and Burns was against this union. So these two issues of a Stuart king being on the throne rather than the House of Hanover, and independence from England, at least on a parliamentary level, were bound together in Burns's poetry. And so many of his poems have this kind of strong Jacobite element. And what Burns does with a lot of them is he brings old songs and poems together, and he calls back to previous eras when the Scots fought against the English, whether that be in the Jacobite rebellions or in older times, such as when William Wallace and Robert the Bruce contested against the English, against Edward I and Edward II. Edward I, the conqueror of Scotland in the medieval era in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And by calling back to these examples, which really led to an independent Scotland under Robert the Bruce, a kind of founding moment for Scotland ever since, he's saying we can tap into that energy again and return once more to an independent and free Scotland, overthrowing the English yoke. And perhaps his most famous poem in this regard is one called Scots Wha Hae. And the opening lines are, Scots Wha Hae wi Wallace bled, Scots Whan Bruce has aften led, welcome to your gory bed o' to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle lower, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Now, of course, the lyrics themselves are focused on that medieval conflict, but actually he's saying it about the current moment. And so he's framing the current moment, he's charging it with a kind of romantic medieval nationalism, which then makes you think, okay, it's just like that. It's inspiring, it's empowering, and framing the current union as one of being enslaved by England. But this is even more the case in another of his poems, a little less well known. And I think it's worth maybe singing a little bit of this one, because it very much hits harder, and it is to do with, it more directly addresses what happened in the union between Scotland and England. Farewell to all our Scottish fame, farewell to our ancient glory, farewell to our Scottish name, safe famed in martial story. Now sacrans o' the Solway sands, tweed runs to the ocean, to mark where England's province stands. Such a parcel of rogues in the nation, what force or guile could not subdue, though many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few. For hireling traitors' wages, the English steel we could disdain, secure in molestation, but English gold has been our bane. Such a parcel of rogues in the nation, but pith and power till my last hour. I'll make this declaration that we're bought and sold for English gold. Such a parcel of dogs in the nation. Now, we might be surprised that Burns's Jacobite nationalist sympathies were so popular in a united Britain under the Hanovers, certainly given the fact that the Jacobite rebellion of 1745 was in some people's living memory, or at least it would be in a grandparent's living memory. These were not things of the distant ancient past like Bruce and Wallace, but were living reminders of just how close the Union came to being overthrown. But by the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, there had become a renewed interest in Scottishness. And I think there was a couple of trends towards this. The first was, or one of the primary ones was James Macpherson's poems of Ossian. Now, James Macpherson was a schoolmaster in the late 1700s in Scotland, and he claimed to discover and to translate several Gallic epic poems, which were essentially like the Iliad for the Scots. And he claimed that they were written by a bard named Ossian. And these poems were international bestsellers. People from all across Europe were reading them and being inspired by them, and in turn were inspired to go and find their own national myths and legends. So people like the Brothers Grimm or Goethe were strongly compelled by these stories, in part because they showed perhaps for the first time that one didn't have to turn to the Romans and the Greeks for the epic, for the ancient world, which was so praised in the Enlightenment. One could turn to one's own national stories to rediscover the character of one's own people. And so it was this kind of historical reconstruction. Even though in Macpherson's case there were strong reasons to think that they were fraudulent, would go on to create a kind of romantic nationalism, a return to the kin, to the folk, that would become so important in 19th century thought. And Burns's Scottish poetry tied into that, and indeed, given Scottishness was the inspiration behind a lot of this movement, it's no wonder that Burns would be too. But secondly, there was a renewed interest in the Highlands. After the Jacobite rebellions, there were the Highland clearances, which saw the displacement of the clans, those which had rebelled, for sheep farming, because landlords realized that they could make more money through sheep farming than by having tenant farmers. And this really broke the back of the threat of the Highlands. But what that meant is, now that it was a safe thing to indulge in, the upper classes in Britain started to become interested in wearing Highland attire, such as the kilt. The bagpipes become acceptable once more. And Walter Scott, who very influenced by James Macpherson and Robert Burns, would oversee when the King George and Queen Charlotte came to Edinburgh, this great Highlandization of Scotland. So all those things that we see today, the kilts, the tartan, the bagpipes, and so on, they kind of have their origins in what he did in that point, in elevating these things to becoming the heart of a kind of ancient national identity for Scotland. And so Burns's poems, with their Scots language and tapping into the Scottish life, which could speak to that present moment or 500 years before, it tied into that very much so, and so became kind of acceptable in even Union circles. Burns's work, I think there's two other elements which need to be touched upon here. The first is that if we take it back from the nationalism, back from the kind of highfalutin romanticism, is there is a lot of love poetry in Burns. Burns was a notorious adulterer and philanderer. He got into trouble with the church many times, being forced to make repentance upon the stool of repentance for his affairs. And he had many children, and from different and many affairs with different ladies. And so a lot of his poems deal with this kind of rustic love making, and that means it has, like a lot of romantic poetry, a lot of passion in it, a lot of feeling of how one feels towards another person. It's not just describing a relationship, it's actually an ode within the relationship itself. Perhaps the most famous of these poems is A Red, Red Rose, which is a song in 1794, based on older songs. And it goes like, I'll reread the first verse for you, first couple of verses. My love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June, or my love's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair as art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. Till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. And I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run. And fare thee well, my only love, and fare thee well a while. And I will come again, my love, though it were 10,000 mile. And so you can see in this poem that, so firstly, Burns is blending his emotions. He's tying his emotions to the natural world, or kind of explaining them through the natural world, so that we have this integration of the rural Scot and his rural environment. But then the character of this love too, it is like the great loves of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. It is absolute. It is the strongest thing, so that it can outlast the overturning of the world, the seas drying up, all of the rocks melting. Even through the end of all things, his love for her will maintain. That's the raw power of this passion that he's feeling. And this is quite typical of the Romantics, that they thought that feeling rather than reason was where truth, good, and beauty, even the transcendent, was revealed. It had a strength. It was the most fundamental of things, or ways of knowing. And Burns, although he's not going into this in a kind of epistemological way, is expressing or tying into this with how he feels for this lady. But the other thing with Burns is just ordinary family fellowship. Many of his poems deal with drinking together, making merriment together, just having nice ordinary life with one another. Perhaps the most famous of his songs in this regard is Auld Lang Syne, which is sung around the world on Hogmanay, the New Year's Eve, to celebrate the coming in of the new year. And you'll recognize it. It goes like this. Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and auld lang syne? For auld lang syne, my Jo, for auld lang syne, we'll tak a cup o' kindness yet, for auld lang syne. So the idea is, for old time's sake, we will drink together once more. And indeed, the cup of kindness was a common thing in the olden days that you would share with one another over the Christmas festive period. It was an expression of love and fellowship and bond with one another, to drink together. So this is also a part of Burns's work. And I think you can see, just from this brief overview, of the many different ways that Burns was able to speak, and how he was able to integrate a vast variety of things together to provide a really hard-hitting set of poems. which elaborated on the Scottish national character, indeed were formative for the Scottish national character, but in a way that wasn't highfalutin and elevated into the stratosphere of myths and legends, but in everyday ordinary life, and actually integrated the great heroes of the past with the present struggles of the ordinary Scots man and woman. So that is a little brief introduction to Robert Burns. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I hope that you go and celebrate Burns Supper or Burns Night on January the 25th. Go and have your haggis, neeps and tatties. And whoever you are, wherever you are, for Auld Lang Syne will tack a cup of kindness yet. Bye for now, friends.